Hello, my name is Ira Forman, and I'm the curator of Moment Magazine's Anti-Semitism Monitor. Prior to this, I was the special envoy at the U.S. State Department for monitoring and combating anti-Semitism. We want to talk a little bit about what the Anti-Semitism Monitor is all about. And it's all about how do we recognize anti-Semitism in all of its complexity. Well, some people say defining anti-Semitism is an easy thing to do, but I'm not so sure. I think it's more akin to what former Supreme Court Justice Potter Stewart said about pornography when he was asked to define it. He said, "I'm not sure I can define it, but I know it when I see it." And the most important thing about anti-Semitism, I think, to understand, and that we try to bring out in the Anti-Semitism Monitor, is its complexity. Let me give you an example. The Fundamental Rights Agency of the European Union, FRA, has taken over the last decade 2 surveys of attitudes of Jews of the European Union toward anti-Semitism. And its first survey, it found that 28% of Jews Europe-wide would answer yes to the question, have you thought about leaving your home country in the last 5 years because of anti-Semitism? Now in Hungary, the number was 48%. And in France, it was 46%. And if you didn't know anything else, you might think, well, anti-Semitism in Hungary and France are very similar. But nothing could be further from the truth. In Hungary, you have an anti-Semitism which is almost exclusively coming from right-wing, xenophobic, ultranationalist sources. And up to now, there's been minimal violence against Jews in Hungary. In France, there are multiple forms of anti-Semitism. There's anti-Semitism from the extreme right, there's anti-Semitism from the extreme left, and there's anti-Semitism from extreme Islamists. And sometimes there is violence from a very, very small minority of extreme Islamists in the Muslim community of France. And this is very concerning. The second thing I think we have to think about anti-Semitism is that it morphs or shift shapes over time to take advantage of new incidents or new facts on the ground. So for example, in the last 2 years, there's become the rise of an anti-Semitism based on the idea of a Jewish conspiracy to inflict COVID on the rest of the world. It also is important to understand where anti-Semitism comes from. It could be coming from general civil society. It could be a specific religious or ethnic group. It could be a socioeconomic group. Or, most concerning to me, it could be coming from governments. And governments are most concerning because in all societies, governments have a monopoly on legitimized violence. And before World War II, it wasn't just Hitler, but it was many countries in Europe which had clearly anti-Semitic governments. It can be characterized by violence, and it could be violence against property, such as vandalism, writing graffiti, taking down mezuzahs. It can be physical violence, from slapping a Jewish man's head to knock off his kippah to actually killing somebody. It can, as we said, come from right-wing, left-wing Islamists or other sources of ideological sources in society. It can be racial. This is an example, of course, is Nazi anti-Semitism, where Jews are defined by their blood. They are subhuman, and blood is something they can't change. So if you convert to Christianity, you're still a Jew because of your blood. It can be religious. So the most common form of anti-Semitism over the last 2,000 years has been Christian anti-Semitism. It can be, in recent decades, related to the state of Israel. The other thing that we are very conscious of is in Anti-Semitism Monitor is it can be found in countries with minuscule or actually no Jewish communities. And finally, we have to ask the question, is anti-Semitism just defined by hatred of Jews? After all, many a times we can't get inside someone's head to say if they really hate Jews. And I'm sure there are many anti-Semites out there who, if you told them that they hate Jews, they would say, of course not. But it also can be defined on whether speech or violence has an impact, a deleterious impact on individual Jews, on Judaism as a religion, or even as Jews as a people. So one of the things we have to be very concerned about in monitoring anti-Semitism and calling out anti-Semitism is false charges of anti-Semitism. False charges of anti-Semitism essentially tie our hands in the effort to combat anti-Semitism. And we need to avoid it as best we can. Now, it's not always clear. There are many gray areas. But one hint is that when we see people or institutions calling out anti-Semitism consistently against their ideological or political opponents, but never calling it out against any of their ideological or political allies, that is a good indication that this may very well be a false charge of anti-Semitism. We also need to report anti-Semitism incidents, even if they're not crimes, even if they're just hate speech. Report it to law enforcement, because one of the ways we track anti-Semitism, one of the ways we learn about anti-Semitism is data. And law enforcement agencies are supposed to report incidents of anti-Semitism as well as other forms of bias to the FBI, who in turn puts out a report on anti-Semitic hate crimes every year. And of course, we want you to report any incidences of anti-Semitism that we might miss. We do a very extensive search weekly for cases of anti-Semitism. We don't always catch everything, and having citizen activists out there is important. Ultimately, we use Anti-Semitism Monitor as a tool in the fight against anti-Semitism. For if we're going to combat this disease, we have to know it in all its forms. We have to know how it manifests itself differently in different countries. We have to know how it changes over time. And as I always like to say, this is not just the job of government officials. It's not just the job of Jewish organizations. It is the job of every one of us as citizen activists. Thank you so much, and we hope you make use of this tool, the Anti-Semitism Monitor.